Over the last 43 years, I've interviewed over 150 U.S. military veterans, persons who were missile launch officers, nuclear missile targeting officers, missile maintenance personnel, security guards who guarded the nuclear weapons facilities, and all of those individuals have told me on tape, either audio or video, that in fact UFOs have routinely monitored our nuclear weapons going back decades, and on occasion apparently have actually interfered with the functionality of those weapons. This is obviously very dramatic testimony from these individuals. There have been also hundreds of documents released through the Freedom of Information Act that back up to some degree what these individuals are saying, that UFO incursions at nuclear sites in general are just a matter of course. The military knows full well they're going on, continue to go on, and have quite clearly decided the public should be kept in the dark about all this. All of the veterans laugh at that hypothesis when the skeptics say this had to be some sort of military exercise to test their readiness. They say, you know, our missiles, 10 missiles, were shut down for 24 hours. It impacted the national security of the United States. If war had been declared by the Soviet Union back when these things were going on, these 10 missiles would not have been able to fly anywhere. Said the Air Force simply would not degrade our capability just for the purposes of an exercise. The FBI released documents to a man named Dr. Bruce Maccabee many years ago, which confirmed that as early as 1948, UFOs were flying around the Los Alamos labs. They were being tracked on radar, chased by jet aircraft. Los Alamos was the birthplace of nuclear weapons. It's where all the scientists worked on the Manhattan Project during the war. So this goes back to the earliest days of the nuclear era. A year after my book was published in '08, I was contacted by a Navy pilot, a veteran who flew in World War II. His squadron was stationed at a place called NAS, Naval Air Station Pasco in Washington State. Right across the river was the Hanford site where plutonium was produced, not only for the Trinity site blast in New Mexico, but the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. And he told me in '09 that on 3 occasions in January of '45, even before the bombings in Japan, that his squadron chased away luminous glowing objects hovering above the Hanford site. And a researcher named Jan Aldrich in 2013 accessed documents from the 4th Army Group confirming that indeed unidentified aerial objects were tracked near the Hanford site on 3 occasions in January of '45, precisely what my source told me. So even before the bombs were dropped on Japan, we have UFOs nosing around nuclear weapon sites. You know, who knows what their motivation is. I have been optimistic over the years and hope that the fact that the Soviets had these problems too with UFOs interfering with their nuclear weapons, perhaps some third party, some outside party, I think extraterrestrials, understand that humans really are fallible creatures, and we now have these very deadly weapons. We can destroy not only our civilization, we can pollute the planet with radioactivity for thousands and thousands of years if we have a major nuclear exchange. So I'm hoping that someone is stepping in, wagging a finger at us and the Russians and saying, you know, think twice. This is committing mass suicide if you actually launch these things. But I also have to say, and I tell my lecture audiences this, they probably have vested self-serving interests as well. Maybe they have projects here, maybe they have bases here. It's conceivable that if we screw up our planetary environment, we're also impacting whatever they have going on here. Who knows? You are the person responsible for accessing the majority of the documents from the former Soviet Union. You're the person that went in and interviewed former Soviet military personnel about UFO activity after the Soviet regime collapsed. And to your credit, you're the one that got the documents out of Russia that talked about UFOs actually activating nuclear missiles in Soviet Ukraine in October of '82. So yes, it is worldwide. If one goes on the internet, you can find that there were lots of UFO sightings in India and Pakistan in the late 1990s when they were testing their weapons underground and saber-rattling and threatening nuclear war with each other. The film is at Vimeo on demand. It's called UFOs and Nukes, The Secret Link Revealed. And the feedback I've gotten in the 2 months that it's been available online has just been overwhelmingly favorable. I would call them rave reviews. Some people have said this is the best UFO documentary they've ever seen. I actually, after my book came out in 2008, between then and now, I've been contacted by 14 separate production groups that wanted me to go on their UFO documentary show and be a talking head. And I knew they'd screw it up, but they always do. They always add in fluff and BS. And so I didn't want to associate myself or my research with that kind of production. And thank God, an individual named Jared Tarbell, a businessman in Albuquerque, contacted me 3 or 4 years ago and said, I support your work. If you want to make a film, I will provide the money to make a documentary film. So we now have this 48-minute documentary that many people are saying is the best UFO documentary they've ever seen. In my book, I have interviews with, I would say, a dozen, just off the top of my head, 10 or 12 veterans who were involved in the nuclear testing in one capacity or another, who indeed confirmed UFO incidents. And the most interesting person was named Walter Levine. He was a security policeman. He said that one day his commander came to the security police group. They were, involved with security for some of the tests at the site in 1955. And he said that they asked for 3 volunteers to be part of what was called the Ground Observer Corps. He showed me certificates confirming X number of hours that he spent being part of the Ground Observer Corps. But he said in reality that what we did was go into this shack that was located at just off the boundary of the test site where they were detonating all these weapons. And our job was to look through a scope, like a theodolite, against a window that had a grid on it that would measure altitude and distance and direction. And when we saw unusual aerial objects, we were to look through the scope and align it with this grid system on the window that would allow them to determine the distance of the object, its altitude, its direction of flight. And once we saw an anomalous object, he said they were all luminous, they were disc shaped, some of them he said were square shaped. We were to pick up a telephone in this little shack. He said there was no dial tone, the voice would just come on. We would read off all these coordinates, the direction of the object, the altitude, etc. And then he said when we wrote this stuff down on a piece of paper, we were then to burn the paper in a trash can in the shack. And he said, we weren't supposed to talk about this. Obviously, we're told not to talk about this. But he said the other volunteers and myself would discuss it with each other. What do you think's going on here? And it was clear to us that these clearly were UFOs and that the military knew they were going to be nosing around the nuclear tests. They had set up this system to try to evaluate the presence of the object. And of course, you're not going to get any of that information through FOIA. They'll just deny that any of that happened. Precisely. He said it was so, systematically organized. They clearly, he was there for, I think he said 2 years. Clearly, they had sightings going back even earlier than that. They knew it was going to be an ongoing thing. When the bombs were detonated, UFOs would appear. And so they set up this monitoring system and asked for volunteers out of the security police group. I think lots of civilians, especially back at that time, they were afraid of ridicule. They may have reported it to friends or family and probably were laughed at more often than not and just decided not to contact the media or even the military. But yes, in my film, I believe I have a couple of headlines from Nevada of civilians working in the area of the Nevada test site seeing these objects as well. Of the majority of the 150 veterans I've interviewed, especially from the era of the 60s and 70s, tell me just that. I was told in 1966 never to discuss this, and I took that seriously. Some of those people were threatened with legal action. They had to sign what are called national security non-disclosure statements, which stipulated if you reported a UFO incident at a missile site and then talked about it, you would be subject up to 10 years in jail and a $10,000 fine. And so even into, the last decade after the year 2000, well into the 21st century, some of these guys were still worried that the FBI would come knock on their door and, or their retirement pay would be docked or whatever. That's never happened. I think the Air Force understands that if these veterans are courageous enough to talk to me and go on, CNN's live stream my press conference, if they're willing to do that, if some government agency suddenly harasses these guys, they're likely just to go to people like you, to the media, and say, I was involved in this incident. I decided the public needed to know about it, so now I'm talking about it, and the FBI showed up. So, they don't want to deal with that. It's ongoing, it's continuous. I have tried, since I have so many veterans from the Cold War era, I'm trying to find veterans who are now in their late 20s who've separated from the service, who were involved in incidents at, for example, Area 2, which is the now closed nuclear weapons storage area at Nellis Air Force Base. I know of UFO reports there from veterans who, again, are in their late 20s, early 30s, who are talking about incidents that happened in the 2005 timeframe. So I'm continually looking for updated reports. I won't talk to active duty servicemen. I don't want to create problems for them. But anyone who's a veteran who knows of something that's gone on in the last year or 5 years, I'm very interested in hearing it. Well, we've downsized our nuclear weapons arsenal certainly over the last 20 years after the end of the Cold War. The question is, why did we do it? Are people from the US and the Russian governments getting together and saying, we both know, even though we can't tell our citizens, that someone's trying to tamper with our nukes? Are they sending us a message? Should we be downsizing? We don't know if that's gone on, or if it's just a question that finally, after these ridiculously high numbers of nukes over the last 50 years that we've had in our possession, whether someone is finally starting to come to their senses and saying, we need to start downsizing. Who knows? I mean, those are the kinds of secrets that if I live to be 100, I'll never know, you'll never know. But someone's talking to someone in the Pentagon and CIA and in the Kremlin. They know this is going on. They know it's very real. They have to deal with it. It's not a fantasy. So presumably there are some intelligent people who are tuned in to what's going on and hopefully taking appropriate actions. Well, we know from the Big Sur case, which is mentioned both in my book and in my film, in September of '64, there was a series of test launches from Vandenberg Air Force Base, California. 2 officers, Robert Jacobs and Florence Mansman, who were involved in all of that, have publicly said that they were filming this one missile test. They saw a dummy nuclear warhead separating from its rocket booster and flying out over the Pacific. Suddenly this domed disc, an object with a dome, came in to frame, circled the warhead, which was flying about 8,000 or 10,000 miles an hour, shot 4 beams of light at it, whereupon the dummy warhead fell into the Pacific Ocean and the UFO left the vicinity. That would suggest they have the capability, the UFO pilots, the capability of shooting down missiles in flight. The question is, if we launch 1,000 missiles and the Russians launch 1,000 missiles, can they cope with that size situation? We don't know.